again to another edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook, and with me today is Miss Karen Tate, an independent scholar, speaker, radio show host, published author, and social justice activist. She lives in Venice, California, and she has quite a resume of writing. We're going to be talking with Karen today about The Voices of the Sacred Feminine, a book on conversations to reshape our world. And it is a very interesting read, and it's something that I'd like to know more about. Karen, first of all, welcome to the program. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, John.
We have had a lot of different views of what constitutes spirituality or the denial thereof on our show. And this is an interesting book, and I'd like to kind of start people off with a better understanding of what people who are seeking the divine feminine are about. Well, I don't want them to frame it in such a way that it's a cult or maybe we need to bring the Inquisition back or anything like that. But it is an important contribution, a recognition that spirit is has qualities of both masculine and feminine, and that we need to recapture those because for the last 3 millennia, most predominant religions have been patriarchal. True.
And that is so unfortunate because all one needs to do is go into a reputable museum and you will see that the feminine face of God has been revered by humanity in one part of the world or another, in fact, across the globe, for 30,000 years. You know, you look at the Venus of Willendorf, the whole Fels Venus they just found recently. We have innumerable artifacts, textiles, archaeological sites that really show that, the feminine face of God has been around much longer than even our male face of God. But that's not what we're taught in the West. And I can understand that because I grew up in the bubble of that Bible Belt in the South. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't something you even heard about, much less were taught to consider as a viable spirituality. You know, the only feminine face in spirituality we were allowed to know about or allowed to embrace was, the beautiful Mary, who was Jesus' mother. But unfortunately, that's a role model that doesn't really allow women to be more than a mother, be more than passive, and it sort of prevents women from achieving their fullest potential. But the feminine face of God, when you really start to discover it, whether it's you look at it from the perspective of deity, that actually resides in the heaven and, cares about you and you pray to her and maybe she intercedes in your life. But there's also the archetype, or if that's not a familiar term, think of it as role model. And there's also values of the sacred feminine, which are sadly lacking in our world. And, those are values like caring, sharing, nurturing, partnership, negotiation, instead of domination, exploitation, discrimination, which so many of us are suffering from in the world. Mm-hmm. So, so it's a big subject, and I'm not sure which direction you want to go, but that's sort of a little maybe jumping off point.
Yeah, I do want to look at some of the figures and what they represent. I was interested in what you said about whether the divine feminine is a deity or something else, because we draw on knowledge of what constitutes the feminine contribution to the world in both mythology and literature. As you're going through these various figures that represent the feminine, would you characterize the divine feminine as something that exists outside the normal plane of material world?
Yes. I mean, just like it's hard for people to define God. It's no different with goddess. She means different things to different people. She is everything all around us. She is, bigger than we can even comprehend. Is there one monotheistic, divine feminine, or does she have many individual faces? But I can tell you across continents and cultures, we have multitudes varieties of the sacred feminine, whether we're talking about the Shinto of Japan, the people of Asia with Kuan Yin, the Indians of India have never given up on their goddess, for thousands of years. We have Guadalupe, down in South America. We have the Polynesian goddesses. I could go on and on. She's out there. It's just that in our Judeo-Christian mindset, especially here in the United States, so many people think that's all there is, that's all there was, but they just haven't looked very deeply. They haven't obviously traveled very much, visited archaeological sites, explored museums, and if they did, it really opens up a whole new world.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned already a couple of times the issues that face our world around sex, religion, power, and politics, and the book discusses the fact that prior to the last 3 millennia, when the Abrahamic patriarchal religions emerged and began to dominate, there were much more egalitarian cultures. There was much more acknowledgement of the feminine, both in religion and rulers.
Well, we believe that, and archaeological evidence will bear it out. For instance, in Minoan Crete is one example of a place where we saw equality among the sexes. We have records that show that, there were women who owned companies and, trading companies. And in Egypt, women could own property and divorce their husbands. For people who think it's always been this way of male domination, it really just it is an example of sort of the spin that has been, put on history, I think, to justify the way it is right now. Mm-hmm. But it hasn't always been this way. Of course, there have even been and still are in some, parts of the world, matrilineal and matrifocal cultures where the assets were passed from mother to daughter. And sometimes, when you really look at the benefits of that, if there's a divorce, instead of women and children often ending up at the margins of society, they don't suffer that way. Because if the assets are passed from, mother to daughter, then, the women and children, don't find themselves sort of at the mercy of, the economy as it is. Because 70% of women, retire in poverty, even though only, women are 52% of people on the planet. We own 20% of the assets and do 80% of the work. So there's been, a huge, disparity, and what women have been allowed to do. We still have women suffering from, unequal pay. We see in the Sony scandal that, with the emails that were just exposed, a great example, even in Hollywood, the woman, the Hunger Games woman, her and I think it was Meg Adams who played in this movie recently, the women are paid less than the men. We see it over and over and over again, and that ends up in a woman's life can mean the difference of $400,000 by the time she's ready to retire. So, you can connect the dots between losing a feminine face of God, losing women's standing as equals, to what women suffer today. They have female genital mutilation, we have domestic violence, an assortment of things that women have to endure in their lifetime because they're looked at as, they're devalued, they're marginalized, they just simply aren't looked at as equal to men. Heck, we have, men in Congress telling women what they can or can't do with our bodies, So, it's a big subject here.
Mm-hmm. And the impact of that imbalance between the masculine and the feminine, you discussed the 4 legs of the stool: racism, sexism, environmental, and cultural exploitation. And you've mentioned some of the problems that's resulted in, from abuse and genital mutilation to inequality and suffering. If we begin to delve into what it is one is seeking when one seeks the sacred feminine, the deity, the archetype, and even the ideal. One of the people you interviewed was Amy Peck, and she defines the sacred feminine as a concept that recognizes God as ultimately neither anthropomorphically male or female, but a divine essence between form and duality that's a balance of masculine and feminine. Mm-hmm. And the balance, I guess, is what's been missing for contemporary civilization.
Yes, and until we can strike that balance again, I think, people have never learned what the sacred feminine is. So how do you strike a balance until you put some emphasis on the missing part, if you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So, there's so many people that don't really understand what the essence of the sacred feminine is. She's some of those values and qualities I mentioned. It's partnership, it's negotiation, it's trying to create win-win situations and winners and losers. And you can see how this would create a different culture out there if we didn't have this sort of dog-eat-dog, survival of the fittest sort of predator world where we have the 99% and the 1%, if you get my drift. So, yeah, I think ultimately, and I believe this myself, I think whatever the divine essence is, I think it is a combination of the masculine and feminine essence, because after all, we are a reflection of it. It is a reflection of us. And but the problem is that in our current culture, so much of the planet has been told there is only the masculine. Mm-hmm. And if you're told, mythology shapes our culture, and if the mythology is only about a male god, and all of the mythology of the feminine goddess has swept beneath the rug, then you end up with a male-dominated culture, and we see all of the problems that come up as a result of that.
Mm-hmm. Now, we have in this civilization of Abrahamic religions, we have elevated God the Father over Mother Earth, but Mother Earth, matter, the material world, matter comes from the same root as the word for mater, and the symbol of motherhood, of goddess and priestess, is something that we've sort of lost sight of or developed a fear of or a disrespect for.
It's true, it's true when you think about it. Christianity robbed us of the sacredness of the earth around us, robbed us of the sacredness of our bodies. And that really has to be restored, because until we realize, as the ancient people did, that the earth was sacred, that we are sacred, that sexuality is sacred. After all, it's how we reproduce and, keep life going. Until we start to look at those things again as gifts, as something sacred, then I think we will continue to be in trouble, because we think nothing of poisoning the earth and fracking and, poisoning the water, the air, overdevelopment, climate change, all of these things we're doing to Mother Earth, who provides everything we need to sustain ourselves. But, even she can only take so much before there's some sort of purge, I think. And maybe that's what climate change is going to be. And likewise, you can see how patriarchal culture not only has devalued the earth, but patriarchal culture has devalued woman, has devalued the species on the planet. Everything is here to be dominated, to be used, to be abused, unfortunately by some. And instead of the patriarchy being wise stewards, instead of patriarchy being protectors, they have instead become dominators, and that's where things, I think, have really gone askew. Because the new archetype for men in the idea of the sacred feminine is not this dominator. Instead, he is a protector. Instead, he is allowed to be a nurturer. Because don't for a minute think that the patriarchal culture has not also hurt men. Men are also prevented from being their authentic selves, because they're told, that men have to be these macho men or they're not real men. I mean, we know about that. Gentle men, nurturing men, men who maybe are more interested in the arts or football. Well, those men are effeminate, and somehow they're not real men. But that's just another aspect of patriarchy that's hurt men, just like patriarchy has denied women their fullest potential.
And interesting, the impacts on Mother Earth. You talked about those destructive forces, but even amongst humans, the idea of the divine feminine is fostering peace and moderation and balance and positivity and synchronicity and all things that I think most of us who are intelligent at all would value.
Well, absolutely. But yet you have this disinformation out there. Look, the powers that be, capitalism, corporate-controlled media, we are told what to think. I mean, just turn on Fox News, and it's all about divisiveness rather than inclusiveness. It's about, fighting one another rather than solidarity, rather than the importance of, the collective and looking out for one another. And I think that's, unfortunately, that's part of the problem. The people that have the megaphones are not the people who want to promote these sorts of ideas, because maybe it's not the best idea for the 99%, it's the best idea for the 1% who are pulling all the strings. Riane Eisler, who's also in Voices of the Sacred Feminine, the anthology, has long been teaching about our culture being a dominator pyramid, and at the top you have the dominators, and the rest of us, for the most part, are down at the bottom of the pyramid, sort of just cogs in the wheel, and they're sort of pulling all the strings. Well, until we can get away from that dominator mindset that we are, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, even if you don't have bootstraps, you're lazy if you're not rich, these sorts of things, with not given any credence to maybe, you had no opportunities in life, or you've been dealt a bad hand, or, maybe you're not the right color, or you don't live in the right country, or whatever it is. Everyone doesn't have the same opportunities in life, and to pretend that we do is really a farce. And I think as long as we deny that we are our brother's keeper, that we should be using caring and sharing and trying to uplift one another, trying to empower one another, until we start to see that as what we should all be taught, that we should all be practicing, I think we're going to continue to have this struggle between the haves and the have-nots, between the 1% and the 99%.
There are so many thought-provoking aspects of this first interview with Amy Peck, or this first chapter written by her, and we don't have time to get into them in detail, because I do want to talk about some of the divine images that are discussed. But just a flavor of how much one could spend time discussing this first chapter. The divine feminine respects egalitarian partnership, honors the cycle of life of the body and individual, and respects the process of death as natural, respects a woman's freedom of choices in family planning, birth control, and birth giving, regards the dark side of nature and human consciousness not as evil, but as a manifestation of the winter and the destructive cycle of nature, and thus part of the eternal process of life and learning, encourages us to hold intention of compassion, promotes personal integrity, honors the language of the heart. I mean, it's so rich with, we could have dozens of conversations about this just from those pages. Yeah,
and that's just one chapter. And, there are, I think, 35 contributors in Voices of the Sacred Feminine talking about, the many faces of the divine feminine as deity or archetype. You have ideas in there for social activism and things that people have been doing to try to teach these ideals, out there in the world, women and men. And, that's another thing I think needs to be stressed, John, is so many people, I think, are under the misconception that women are only interested in this. And that's so untrue. I mean, in the book there, you have Noam Chomsky, for heaven's sake. You have Father Roy Bourgeois. You have Matthew Fox. You have Patrick McCullum. And, I mean, I could go on and on. The point being that evolved men are on board with this. This isn't just something that a bunch of angry women are going about, change that they're asking for. It's really about sustainability for the planet. It's really about justice. It's really about equality. And I honestly think if you don't think those things are important, then maybe it's time to have a hard look within, because why would you not want those things?
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about a few. We'll start with Lady Liberty because she had her roots in ancient Rome, I think, but, we have a statue in New York Harbor of Libertas.
Yeah, well, we consider her the political goddess, frankly, and it's not a contemporary invention. As you said, we had Lady Libertas in ancient Rome because the Romans deified virtues, and one of the virtues they deified was liberty and freedom and equality and justice. And, all we need to do is look at her and what she stands for, and she is a perfect example of values of the sacred feminine.
Mm-hmm. Kali Ma, goddess of social justice and change.
Yes, absolutely. When the British took over India and they saw Kali, they had no idea what they were looking at. And of course, because she is, dark-skinned, racism crept up. But Kali is, in fact, if you look at the mythology, Kali was the goddess that was called upon when all the gods were unable to stamp out evil. It was Kali that was the one that was most powerful, that could rid the world of evil and suffering. And in a sense, that's one of the reasons why she is the goddess of social justice, because there are so many evils in the world today. Multinational corporations, just to name one, our loss of democracy, sexism, racism, classism, exploitation, all of these evils in the world. She is one goddess we can look to help us, dissolve those things.
Mm-hmm. And then we'll turn to Egypt. Sekhmet, a powerful woman.
Yeah, Sekhmet, the lion-headed Egyptian goddess, she has become an archetype or role model for female empowerment. You look at a mother lioness, she hunts in her pride with other women, other females. So it's sort of a role model for women to get along and work together. She can be a powerful protectress, but yet she's a mother. She's playful. She's independent. She can go out there and hunt and get what she needs to take care of her family. She's sort of a goddess that women look to for personal empowerment, for strength, tenacity, to be able to say no and set healthy boundaries. She's becoming a symbol for women that of what they want to become in the world, no longer marginalized and devalued and exploited.
And an interesting one because she had so many faces and so many roles. But there was a line in there that I made a note of myself to ask you what that means. Women who are drawn to her receive many gifts from her. I've asked women how working with Sekhmet had empowered them. What does it mean to work with a goddess?
Well, work with goddess, it's sort of like, I hate to throw it back to God, working with God. You meditate on her, you maybe pray to her if you believe she's a deity in the heavens, you learn all you can about what she symbolizes, what her attributes are. Maybe you want to embody those attributes of strength, tenacity, passion, courage. So you want to emulate her, maybe, in a sense. She's a symbol, for you. Maybe she's a deity for you. Maybe she, what she represents, you want to see more of in the world. So you focus on her.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a good way of saying how you work with her. You focus on her.
Okay. So from a couple of ancient goddesses, I want to move to two figures before we close, and we only have about 5 minutes left. And both of them come from traditional Abrahamic religions. The first is Mary Magdalene. So much has been written about and thought about her since the emergence of the Da Vinci Code and the discovery of the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Nag Hammadi libraries, the extra-biblical literature. Here's this woman who stands as a model, what the chapter title says, doorkeeper to ancestral intelligence. How does she fit into the mix?
Well, I said at the beginning of the interview that the Mary, or the female figure, role model that patriarchy would allow us to have is Mary, the mother of Jesus. I also mentioned that, while she's a beautiful role model, she's also passive. She's a mother without sex. She's this half woman, really. How can a woman emulate her? Because how can you focus on her and have her as your role model when that means spending your whole life being passive, your whole life denying your sexuality. Mary Magdalene is sort of the other half of Mary. If you put Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Mary Magdalene together, well, then you might have a whole woman. Because Mary Magdalene has come. That idea, that essence, that goddess, if you will. I mean, she's different things to different people. She's become very important to women. I think especially, women in the Judeo-Christian arena, because they can look to her as their goddess, and we do embrace her and Mary, the mother of Jesus, as a goddess too, because now they can be whole. Now they don't have to be ashamed of their sexuality. Now they can, not just be this, benign intermediary. They can step up into their role as lover, as mother, and without shame. Mm-hmm. She sort of also offers the potential of life, the potential for women, because, some also believe that she was the mother of Jesus's children. So, she symbolizes so many different things, but she goes beyond the Mary that is Jesus's mother and allows women to be a woman, the natural woman that they are, instead of denying a part of themselves. Mm-hmm. She allows them to be whole.
Mm-hmm. And I would be remiss if I didn't take a minute to ask you about the Black Madonna stories in Europe.
Well, the Black Madonna stories, those are wonderful because they really point to a time when Isis and the sacred feminine of the pagan goddesses were actually revered by humanity. And in many cases, you actually have these statues of Mary, where if you remove the paint, you find out they were really statues of Isis. When Christianity was trying to get people away from their pagan faith, they co-opted a lot of the sacred sites, a lot of the ritual, a lot of the meaning, and within paganism, they also co-opted a lot of the statues, a lot of the goddesses, and Isis was one. So they took Isis and Horus, her son Horus, who often sits in her lap, and you end up with Mary and Jesus, when we just, repainted it and changed the names. She also represents the darkness of the earth, of Mother Earth, the soil. There's so much more to the Black Madonna than we can really go into here. But some think of her as the goddess who was dormant as Christianity took hold and tried to obliterate the sacred feminine from the consciousness of humanity. But she sort of stayed there dormant in our psyches until we could rediscover her again.
I think it's also very telling that the statues are repainted in the image of the latest religion, because I think so many of the mythological aspects merge together when you look at all of the religions and all of the spiritual practices across the world. So
true. And I mean, how many Christians know that so much of their religion is actually pagan? You know, I mean, we really all have to take responsibility for our own education and not just stop at what they tell us at you know, in the pulpit, or tell us at the dining room table, or, you know, the religious leader on TV. You know, look further, because I think if you really take responsibility for your own education, we find that we really do have a lot more in common than we're different. And I think when we start to see that, then the polarization, you know, might start to diminish.
And that is an excellent final argument for Voices of the Sacred Feminine, Conversations to Reshape Our World. This is an anthology that is thought-provoking and fascinating. It's edited by the Reverend Dr. Karen Tate, who's been our guest this morning. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. I remind you, if you don't hear our show the 4 times it broadcasts every week on National Public Radio 88 FM, you can also catch us on YouTube. Just look for Good Books Radio, Strong and Cook, and you'll find most of our recent shows posted up there. Thanks for listening.